John Bolton, thanks so much for joining us. I suppose we should start with news from President Trump directly saying that you are on a blacklist of jobs. Apparently, that no one is to approach him, suggesting you, among others, for jobs in the incoming administration. I'm sure you probably weren't expecting one anyway, and he describes you as dumb as a rock. What do you make of that?
Well, it's a typical Donald Trump. Here's a guy in a couple days is going to become the most powerful man in the world for the second time, and he's worried about people that he's had disagreements with getting anybody who's ever worked for him into his government. And I hate to be the one to break it to him, but several of the people he's already announced did work for me in the past. So his red line has already been crossed. I'm sure that's true for some of the other people. But it's a playground kind of thing. This is Donald Trump. It's not about philosophy. It's about personal fealty to him.
What do you think the world could expect in terms of foreign policy? What can the world expect from the second Trump administration? Do you think it will be and look and feel quite similar to the first administration, or will there be any significant differences?
Well, I think it will be just as chaotic. That's just the way Trump is. One day he's talking about imposing 60% tariffs on China. The next day he wants to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Now he's forcing the Israeli government to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza that Joe Biden has been working on for 7 months because he wants the conflict out of the way. And the same could happen in Ukraine. He just doesn't want to be bothered with it, which implies he doesn't care, in the case of Ukraine or the Middle East, the terms on which the conflict ends. So I think it will be a very wild ride. I think that will be duplicated in many respects in domestic policy as well, because Trump is just not disciplined by what the job requires.
Do you think that he might be less restrained than he was in his first term, simply because many of the more establishment figures, like yourself from the Republican Party, but others as well, Jim Mattis and so on, they're not going to be there this time?
Right. Well, his what he's seeking in senior officials in his second term are yes men and yes women. I mean, let's be clear. If you look at the range of nominees he's already made public, uh, there are differences in their approach historically to many of the key policy issues we'll be facing. There are huge differences in competence, but the theme that runs through all of them is that they will unhesitatingly say, yes, sir. And ironically, that will not serve Trump well over the long term. It certainly won't serve the country well because it's only somebody like Donald Trump who thinks they really know what the answer is before they even know what the question is or what the facts are. So he doesn't want to be troubled with alternative options or additional information. He hears from some member at Mar-a-Lago that we ought to be doing something in the Middle East, and the next thing you know, he's doing it, and he doesn't want any contrary advice. So yeah, he will do more based on his own opinion, less on the advice of experts. He basically doesn't think you need experts in international affairs, and I think the country will suffer for it, certainly in the long term, possibly in the short term as well.
Do you think that his nominee for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is qualified for that position?
Well, I think in his confirmation hearing, he demonstrated that he wasn't. I mean, I wouldn't be the first to say if you look at the testimony of Pete Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense and contrast it with Marco Rubio to be Secretary of State, you can agree or disagree with Rubio, and I more or less agree with him. He knows what he's talking about. If you looked at the typical Hegseth answer, it was very superficial, shallow. It was kind of talking point someone had given him, and frequent references to how Donald Trump will take care of everything. If he's confirmed, and it certainly looks like he will be, we'll see what his performance is. And at a time of enormous strain on the Defense Department, enormous need for increase in defense spending, we'll see if Hegseth can deliver.
To what extent do you think we in Europe, the UK, but also the EU, will be able to rely, and NATO as well, rely on a Trump administration and a Hegseth-led Defense Department in the next 4 years as a security partner?
Well, I've said frequently, based on my own personal experience, I think Donald Trump wants to withdraw from NATO. And there's some voices around him. Still, Marco Rubio would be one urging against that. But I saw how close he came from a few feet away at the NATO summit in Brussels in 2018. And in connection with ending the war in Ukraine, when people happily say, well, we'll have a NATO peacekeeping force and we'll have security guarantees and so on, I don't think Donald Trump is going to be up for any of that. So the issue of American membership in NATO really could be wrapped up in how the war in Ukraine is resolved.
Because he won't be willing to give security guarantees to Zelensky, will he?
I'd be stunned if he did. I'd be stunned. And his nominee to be the person who will do the negotiating on behalf of the United States with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, was once the subject of this conversation we had in Brussels right before the NATO summit. Trump looked at me and actually looked at Mike Pompeo, who was in the room, and he said, "I wish I had made Keith Kellogg National Security Advisor." He said, "Keith never gives me his opinion unless I ask for it."
Do you think that, what do you think a Trump-led, he's obviously famously said that he would end the Ukraine war in a day. He's already backtracked on that, and I was talking about 6 months. What do you think a Trump-led peace deal that he would recommend to Zelensky would look like?
I think the best evidence we have is what incoming Vice President J.D. Vance said during the campaign, that there would be a ceasefire in place. You'd set up a DMZ along that ceasefire line, which would effectively become the new border between Russia and Ukraine would commit not to join NATO. I mean, that's a plan the Kremlin could sign up to in a second. I assume Vance ran that by Trump before he said it on the campaign trail. Now, with Trump, that's no guarantee that's what he thinks today. But that's what Vance thought that Trump believed back in October.
What would your advice be to European leaders, principally Keir Starmer, thinking about European security? What would your advice be in terms of not only how to handle Trump, but also what we should be doing, given what you've said about Trump potentially wanting to leave NATO?
Well, if there's a desire to keep the United States in NATO, and I'm not sure every country in Europe has that desire, but if there's a desire to do it, the argument that has to be made to Trump is why it is in his personal interest, his political best interest, not to withdraw. Don't argue about the security of Europe. For God's sakes, don't argue about the security of Europe. Don't even bother to argue about the security of the United States. Argue about the greater glory of Donald Trump. And if Keir Starmer can come up with the winning argument along that line, thank God. I want the U.S. to stay in NATO for whatever reason pleases Donald Trump. If we stay in, we can correct the damage after he's gone.
It is said that he has designs on a Nobel Peace Prize. Do you think that that is likely, that is what he wants?
He thinks he deserves it. I mean, I'm not kidding. He thinks he deserves it. And he resents that Barack Obama got it on the way out. And my personal view is Barack Obama, I'm sorry, on the way in,
Yeah.
Obama had barely been president. And in my view, he didn't deserve it. And Trump doesn't deserve it either, at least as of now.
If in some hypothetical world Vladimir Putin were to test test NATO's resolve in terms of making some incursion or a false flag operation or whatever it happened to be at NATO's eastern border, let's say for the sake of argument, the Baltic states, Poland, what do you think Trump's reaction would be?
Well, again, he has said, and his advisor, Keith Kellogg, has said that we should not defend NATO members that are not meeting the 2% Cardiff commitment, 2% of GDP on defense. Poland, the Baltics do meet that criterion. So presumably, if Trump is serious, he would do something to defend him. But there are many ways to weaken NATO, short of outright American withdrawal, and we will have to see what happens after noon on Monday.
You said in December that a major international crisis is much more likely under a second Trump presidency. What do you mean by that, and where do you think that could take place?
Because Trump doesn't base decisions on careful review of information, studying intelligence, consulting experts, considering options, choosing what he thinks is the best option. He has said publicly he thinks relations between the United States and foreign governments depend on his personal relationship with his counterparts. So if he has a good personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, U.S. Russian interests are fine. That is the kind of shallowness of thinking that could lead other countries to believe they have a free hand. And then putting Trump in a corner, you could end up in a very serious crisis that could have been avoided if you had had a more serious president.
Do you have any sense of how he might react if, say, the Chinese were to invade Taiwan?
Well, I don't know for sure what he would do, but I can tell you I saw him several times during the first term sitting behind the Resolute desk, which is a huge piece of wood, thanks to Queen Victoria, sitting behind it in the Oval Office. He'd hold up one of his Sharpie pens, and he'd point to the tip, and he'd say, "See that? That's Taiwan. See this desk? That's China." That's his attitude.
In the sense that he thinks it doesn't matter very much.
Right.
Um, you wrote about this in your very interesting book, but just for people who haven't read it, you were his longest-serving national security advisor, 16 months, I think. What is it like
17.
17 months?
17
Oh, okay, even
Not that
better.
I'm counting.
Even better. What is it like trying to brief Trump? You know, when you go in and you're trying to explain a kind of geopolitical situation, the history, something about which he might only be dimly aware. What is it like trying to brief him?
Well, I can give you a concrete example. When we flew from Turnberry to Helsinki for his 2018 summit with Vladimir Putin right after the NATO summit, we had sent him briefing papers. We always do, although I don't think he ever read very many of them. But I was sitting with him in his office on Air Force One, briefing him on strategic arms questions and the status of the New START treaty and what we knew about Russian capabilities and our own nuclear capabilities. For a few minutes in between action on the TV screen where a FIFA World Cup soccer match was taking place. And so we had about 15 minutes watching soccer and talking strategic arms. That's the best you can do with Trump. Often in his morning intelligence briefings, when he bothered to take them, he didn't read any of that either. But people talked to him. Many of the times, Trump did most of the talking, and not being briefed, but briefing the briefers, which recalled Lyndon Johnson's famous remark, "I don't learn very much when I'm talking." It was could have been made for Donald Trump.
Um, how, I mean, I get a sense of what you think about this already, but how optimistic or pessimistic are you about American leadership in the world for the next 4 years? I mean, is there a best case scenario, and what does that look like, and what's the worst case scenario?
Well, the best case scenario is nothing happens for 4 years. I would be very happy if in 4 years we could have this conversation as if nothing had intervened. That unfortunately is not what we face. There is a serious threat from Russia in Eastern and Central Europe and the Caucasus and Central Asia. There's still the unresolved question of Iran's terrorist and nuclear threats in the Middle East and China's aspirations all along its Indo-Pacific perimeter from Taiwan to the South China Sea and perhaps along the Indian border. So I think there are going to be a lot of crises that will exist, whatever Trump does, and some Trump will create. If we have a trade war, for example, none of us are experienced in trade wars, but that hasn't deterred Trump from talking as he does about very high tariffs with some of America's biggest trading partners. There's simply at this point no way to foresee what Trump will actually propose for tariffs or how our trading partners will react. But I suspect it's easier to get into a trade war than it is to get out of it.
Do you think he's serious about taking military action in Greenland, or is it just nonsense?
No, it's just Trump blowing smoke, but it's another example. He doesn't think about the consequences of his words by saying he wouldn't rule out the use of force against Greenland, which he considers in our national security interest. And so do I, by the way. I looked at this at his behest very carefully in 2019. But by saying he wouldn't rule out the use of force, those are remarks welcomed in Beijing and in the Kremlin. Xi Jinping can say, well, I completely agree with President Trump. I consider Taiwan important to Chinese national security, and I won't rule out the use of force to get it back.
Uh, do you think that we are, in terms of what happens now, it is often said in Britain and in Europe generally, and perhaps it's because you've got politicians like Keir Starmer or Foreign Secretary David Lammy, they will often, I think, maybe try and comfort themselves, and they'll say, look, don't listen to what Trump says, look at what he does. And they try to imply a certain element of continuity and that he's much shrewder in practice than he might be in theory, if you like. Do you think, is that true, or is that just wishful thinking?
It's wishful thinking. There's a lot of that goes on in the United States too. Many of my friends in the Republican Party say it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. It's true Trump doesn't have a philosophy. It's true he doesn't have a grand strategy. It's true he doesn't do policy as we understand that term. It's true that he sees everything through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump. They concede all that, which is an accurate thing to do. And then they say, but look, he wants to be remembered well in history. He wants to succeed. And that's where the blip takes place because they then think, what would I do if I wanted to be successful? and they assume Trump will do that, and that's a mistake. It's not that Trump is predictable. He thinks it's a strength. He's not predictable, and while being deceptive can be useful tactically against your adversaries, it's not usually a good way to conduct alliances. So I think believing that you're going to see policy from Trump is a big mistake. You have to think about Trump the way he thinks about Trump, which is what will make my day to day and make me a bigger figure. That's what he thinks about. That's all that he thinks about. And remember, there are only two kinds of people, winners and losers. And he is not a loser. So if you want what you want in Britain, you've got to convince Trump that giving you that would make him a winner. That's what it's about. You can talk policy till the cows come home. It will not affect him.
Just finally, started this interview talking about this blacklist Trump is talking about. You're obviously, there's a lot of animus clearly from him towards you. He and his allies have sometimes hinted in the past about using the levers of the American state to go after his enemies. Is that something you worry about with regards to yourself?
Well, I think he's talked about it a lot. We'll have to see. It should worry people because that's not a legitimate use of presidential power. I do think our courts will remain independent. I'm sure what gets into court won't get very far, but whether it's me or Liz Cheney or former chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Miller or anybody else, you put them under the Lavrenti-Beria test, as Beria once said to Stalin, "You show me the man, I'll show you the crime." You're going to chew up a lot of people's resources defending against investigations. Trump will be spending the government's money. The targets will be spending their own money. And he knows that. And he's fully prepared to do it, in my view.
John Bolton, thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you.